Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up in ancient China. Not the China of elegant paintings and philosophical musings, not the China of silk robes and palace gardens. The real China, the China where most people lived. You wake before dawn in a small, dark dwelling made of pounded earth. The walls are rough and cold to the touch. There are no windows, just a single doorway covered by a threadbare cloth. The floor beneath you is hard-packed dirt, and you share this cramped space with your entire family. Sometimes 3 generations crowded into a single room, barely 15 feet across. The air is thick with the smell of smoke from the cooking fire, mixed with the odor of unwashed bodies and the livestock kept just outside. There is no running water, no bathroom, no privacy. Welcome to ancient China, where survival was the only goal and comfort was a luxury reserved for a tiny fraction of the population. Before we begin this journey through one of history's most misunderstood civilizations, take a moment to appreciate what you have right now. Clean water at the turn of a tap, a soft place to sleep, the freedom to move without permission, the right to defend yourself in court. These simple things we barely notice, would have seemed like impossible dreams to the vast majority of people who lived in ancient China. Tonight, we're going back to a time when your social class was determined at birth and changing it was extraordinarily difficult. Back to a legal system so brutal that a single accusation could end with your feet being amputated or your body slowly cut into pieces. Back to a world where disease swept through villages like wildfire, where famines killed millions, where women held few rights under the law, and where speaking the wrong words could doom not just you, but your entire family for generations. This is not the China of Hollywood films or romantic legends. This is the China that archaeologists uncover, that historians piece together from contemporary accounts, that emerges from the bones found in mass graves and the records kept by magistrates and tax collectors. This is the China where ordinary people lived and died, often young, often in pain, often without ever knowing anything beyond the narrow confines of their village. The weight of heaven, understanding the imperial system. To understand life in ancient China, we must first understand the system that governed every aspect of existence. At the very top sat the emperor, considered the son of heaven, a semi-divine figure whose mandate to rule came directly from cosmic forces. The concept of the mandate of heaven was not merely symbolic. It shaped political reality. If natural disasters struck, floods, droughts, earthquakes, plagues, these were interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its approval. The emperor could lose his mandate, and with it, his throne, and often his life. The Qin Dynasty, which first unified China in 221 BCE under Emperor Qin Shi Huang, established the administrative framework that would endure for over 2,000 years. The empire was divided into commanderies and counties, each governed by officials appointed by the central government. These officials wielded enormous power over the lives of common people. County magistrates handled tax collection, population registration, military conscription, law enforcement, and public works projects. They submitted reports upward through a strict hierarchy that ultimately reached the emperor himself. Below the emperor existed a carefully stratified social hierarchy. The traditional classification divided society into 4 occupations, ranked by perceived contribution to the state. At the top were the shai, the scholar officials and gentry who ran the government. These men had passed the grueling civil service examinations, which tested mastery of Confucian classics and required years of expensive education. Below them came the nong, the farmers, who were theoretically honored for producing the food that sustained everyone. Third were the gong, craftspeople and artisans who made useful goods. At the bottom, paradoxically, were the shang, the merchants, who were viewed with suspicion despite often being wealthy. They were seen as parasites who produced nothing but simply moved goods around for profit. This official ranking, however, did not reflect the reality of wealth or power. A wealthy merchant might live in far greater comfort than a struggling farmer, yet he would be legally restricted in what he could wear, forbidden from riding in certain vehicles, and his children barred from taking the civil service examinations. The system was designed to reinforce Confucian values of hierarchy, order, and proper roles. Everyone had a place, and stepping outside that place was not just frowned upon, it was often illegal. During the Han Dynasty, which ruled from 202 BCE to 220 CE, this social structure became even more rigid. A 20-rank system installed by earlier reformers assigned specific privileges and restrictions to each level. Higher ranks could wear certain colors and fabrics. They received tax breaks and were exempt from some forms of labor service. Lower ranks faced heavier burdens and harsher punishments for the same crimes. The system was hereditary in practice, if not always in law. If your father was a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. If your grandfather was a slave, your descendants might bear that stigma for generations. Below even the merchants existed categories of people considered mean, outcasts whose status was so low they could not marry ordinary commoners. These included prostitutes, actors, musicians, and certain government servants like jailers and gatekeepers. Many were descendants of indigenous groups that had been conquered and absorbed into Chinese civilization. The Qin Dynasty, centuries later, would make several attempts to elevate some of these groups to ordinary status. But social stigma proved more enduring than legal changes. Understanding this hierarchy is crucial because it determined almost everything about your life. Where you lived, what you ate, what you wore, whether you could read, whether you would face torture if accused of a crime, whether your children had any hope of a better life. The system was designed to be stable, unchanging, eternal, and for the most part, it succeeded. Dynasties rose and fell. Invaders came and went. but the fundamental structure remained remarkably constant across 2 millennia. The daily life of an official in this system was vastly different from that of a peasant, though officials faced their own pressures and dangers. A county magistrate, for instance, had enormous responsibilities. He was judge, tax collector, administrator, military commander, and moral exemplar for his county, all at once. He was expected to maintain order, resolve disputes, catch criminals, collect taxes, conscript laborers for public works, supervise agriculture, conduct rituals, and report upward to provincial authorities. All of this with a small staff of clerks and assistants who were often poorly trained and sometimes corrupt. The magistrate lived in a government compound called a yamen, which served as office, courthouse, jail, and residence all in one. It was both privilege and prison. He could not leave without permission. He could not bring his wife and children if they were from the same region, as the government feared he might develop local loyalties that would interfere with his duties. He served at the pleasure of the emperor, transmitted through layers of bureaucracy, and could be demoted, transferred, or executed if he failed in his duties, or if someone with influence accused him of wrongdoing. Officials wore distinctive clothing to mark their rank. The quality of silk, the colors, the patterns, even the type of hat and belt were all regulated by sumptuary laws. These laws were taken seriously. Wearing clothing above your station could result in punishment. The clothing announced to everyone who saw you exactly where you stood in the hierarchy. It was a system of constant, visible ranking that reinforced social order at every moment. Below the officials, but above the common people, were the clerks, runners, and other government workers who actually did much of the administrative work. These men came from families with some education, but not enough wealth or success to produce examination degree holders. They served as scribes, copyists, tax assessors, jail guards, and executioners. Their pay was often minimal, and they supplemented it through fees, gifts, and bribes from people who needed their service. This created a system where even minor interactions with government, registering a birth, paying taxes, filing a complaint, required bribes just to get the paperwork processed. The merchants, despite their low official status, developed elaborate business practices and formed guilds to protect their interests. Wholesale merchants who dealt in bulk commodities like grain, salt, or textiles could become extremely wealthy, owning multiple shops and warehouses, employing dozens of workers. They lent money at interest, though usury was officially frowned upon. They speculated on commodity prices, buying when prices were low and holding goods until prices rose. They formed partnerships and family businesses that could last for generations. Yet they were always vulnerable. Because their status was low, officials could extort them with relative impunity. A merchant might be required to provide gifts to the local magistrate, fund public works, or provide supplies to the military at below-market prices, or sometimes for free, simply because he had no legal standing to refuse. Some merchants tried to buy their way into respectability by purchasing official titles, which became possible in some dynasties, or by ensuring their sons received education and took the examinations, thus elevating the family into the scholar official class. Artisans and craftsmen occupied an intermediate space in the social order. Skilled workers, potters, weavers, carpenters, blacksmiths, jewelers, created the goods that both wealthy and poor needed. The best craftsmen worked for the imperial court or wealthy patrons, creating beautiful objects of jade, bronze, porcelain, and silk that are treasured in museums today. But most craftsmen were small-scale operators who worked in family shops, passing skills from father to son through apprenticeship systems that could be brutal. Apprentices, often children as young as 7 or 8, worked long hours for years before achieving journeyman status. Masters could beat them, overwork them, and provide minimal food while extracting maximum labor. At the very bottom of this hierarchy were groups considered barely human. Slaves existed throughout Chinese history, though their numbers and treatment varied by dynasty. During the Han Dynasty, scholars estimate that slaves may have constituted roughly 1% of the population, though precise figures are impossible to establish. These enslaved people faced lives of complete powerlessness. State slaves worked in government mines, workshops, and on construction projects, often in conditions that were extraordinarily harsh. Private slaves served as domestic servants, concubines, or field workers. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed with minimal legal consequence for their owners. Some slaves were prisoners of war. Others had been sold by desperate families or had sold themselves to escape debt. In many periods, the children of slaves inherited their enslaved status, creating a hereditary underclass. The mean people, prostitutes, actors, musicians, tanners, executioners, and certain other occupational groups faced legal discrimination that extended for generations. Their children and grandchildren bore the stigma of this status. They could not take the civil service examinations, could not marry into good families, and faced restrictions on where they could live and what occupations they could enter. This system created permanent castes within Chinese society, groups that could never rise no matter their abilities or efforts. Understanding these layers and divisions reveals a society obsessed with hierarchy and order. Every person had a designated place, and staying in that place was not just expected, but legally enforced. The clothing you wore, the food you ate, the house you lived in, the way you addressed others and they addressed you, all of these were regulated by custom and law. It was a society where even your posture and tone of voice were determined by your rank and the rank of the person you were addressing. For modern people accustomed to at least the pretense of equality, this rigidly hierarchical world would feel suffocating and alien. The farmer's burden, a life of endless labor. Let us now descend to where most people actually lived, the farming villages that dotted the Chinese landscape. Roughly 80 to 90% of the population were peasant farmers. They were the foundation upon which the entire civilization rested, yet their lives were brutally hard. A typical farming family lived in a village of perhaps 100 households. These villages were tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone, where marriages were arranged to maintain alliances between families, where disputes were mediated by village elders before they ever reached official attention. The village was your entire world. Most peasants never traveled more than a few dozen miles from where they were born. Your home, as we described earlier, was small and crude. In northern China, where the climate was drier, houses were built from rammed earth, a mixture of sand, clay, and gravel that was pounded until it hardened. This material was durable and could last for years if maintained, but it offered little insulation against the bitter cold of winter or the sweltering heat of summer. The roof was typically thatched with straw or reeds. There were no windows in poor homes, because windows required frames and coverings, materials that cost money. Light came through the doorway during the day, and at night you sat in near total darkness, broken only by a small oil lamp or the glow of the cooking fire. Inside this single room, an entire family lived. Grandparents, parents, children, sometimes unmarried aunts or uncles. Privacy was unknown. You slept on the floor on thin mats, huddled together for warmth in winter. Your possessions were few: cooking pots, farming tools, perhaps a change of clothes, little else. Furniture was minimal or absent entirely. The wealthy might have tables and stools, but peasants had none. You sat on the floor, ate on the floor, worked on the floor when weather drove you inside. The work itself was back-breaking. Chinese agriculture, especially rice cultivation in the south, required intensive labor. Rice paddies had to be flooded and maintained at precise water levels throughout the growing season. Young rice plants were transplanted by hand, one at a time, with workers bent over for hours in muddy water that often reached their knees or thighs. Your back would ache constantly from this posture. Your hands would become wrinkled and infected from constant exposure to water. Leeches and other parasites in the paddy water would attach to your legs. Irrigation channels needed constant maintenance. One breach could flood an entire field or leave it too dry, destroying months of work. Fields had to be weeded regularly, a task that required hours of careful labor to avoid damaging the crop. Fertilization with human and animal waste, night soil as it was called, meant handling excrement daily, exposing you to parasites and disease. Protection from pests required vigilance and labor. Birds would eat the grain, requiring someone, often children, to spend hours in the fields shouting and waving to scare them away. Rats, insects, and other vermin had to be fought constantly. In the north, where wheat and millet dominated, the work was somewhat different, but equally exhausting. These crops were less water-intensive, but they still required plowing, planting, weeding, and careful timing. The plow, even when pulled by an ox, still required human guidance and strength. You walked behind it for hours, day after day, until your legs and shoulders burned with fatigue. Stone and metal tools were expensive and had to be maintained carefully. A broken plow blade or damaged sickle could set you back significantly. Tool repair and maintenance was yet another skill you had to master. You worked from dawn until dusk, 6 days a week, following the agricultural calendar that had governed your ancestors for generations. Spring brought planting season, a frantic time when every day mattered. Plant too early and a late frost might kill the seedlings. Plant too late, and the growing season would be too short. The entire village worked together during planting, helping each other because there was too much work for individual families to manage alone. This communal labor was essential, but also created obligations. If you helped your neighbor plant, you expected help in return. Failing to fulfill these obligations could lead to social ostracism. Summer was the growing season, requiring constant vigilance. You inspected crops daily for signs of disease, pest damage, or insufficient water. Irrigation systems had to be maintained. Ditches had to be cleared of debris. Small dams and channels had to be repaired. Weeding was never-ending work. The moment you finished weeding one field, the weeds in the field you had weeded first would already be growing back. Children as young as 5 or 6 were put to work weeding, their small hands better suited to the delicate work of removing weeds without damaging crop plants. Autumn brought harvest season, the most intense period of the year. The grain had to be cut at exactly the right time. Too early, and the grain would not be fully developed, reducing yields. Too late, and it might fall from the stalks or rot from rain. Once cutting began, every member of the family worked. Men wielded sickles to cut the grain. Women and children bundled it into sheaves. The sheaves had to be carried to a threshing area, where the grain was separated from the chaff. This was done by beating the sheaves with flails, or by having animals walk over them to crush the stalks. The grain then had to be winnowed, tossed into the air so the wind could blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain fell back down. This required good weather and strong arms. After winnowing came storing. The grain had to be thoroughly dried to prevent mold and rot during storage. It had to be protected from rats, which could destroy months of food in days if given access to granaries. Some grain had to be set aside as seed for next year's planting. Some had to be paid to the landlord as rent. Some had to be given to the tax collector. What remained, if anything remained, was your family's food supply for the coming year. If you had miscalculated, if the harvest was poor, if the tax collector took more than expected, you would go hungry. Winter was the season of slightly less intense field work, but there was no rest. Farming equipment had to be repaired or replaced. The house needed maintenance before the cold truly set in. Firewood had to be collected and stored. If you raised silkworms, winter was when you prepared the mulberry trees and equipment for the spring silkworm season. Women would spend winter months spinning thread and weaving cloth, making clothes and blankets for the family or to sell for extra income. Food preservation was another winter task. Pickling vegetables, smoking or drying any meat you had, ensuring supplies would last until the next harvest. There was no mechanical assistance for any of this work. Everything was done by hand or with the help of an ox or water buffalo if you were fortunate enough to own one. Draft animals were expensive and required care. Feeding, housing, treatment when sick or injured. Many peasant families could not afford them and had to rent animals from wealthier neighbors at costs that ate into their meager resources. Some families worked together, pooling resources to buy and share a draft animal, but this required coordination and trust that could break down when tensions arose. But your labor did not benefit only your family. The government demanded a share. Tax rates varied by dynasty and period, but they were always substantial. During parts of the Han Dynasty, farmers owed a land tax on their harvest. The rate fluctuated, but could reach 1/10 to 1/15 of production, plus additional levies on products like silk, salt, and iron. There were also labor taxes, known as corvée duty, which required able-bodied men to work on government projects for a certain number of days each year. This might mean building or repairing roads, constructing canals, maintaining city walls, or even working on massive imperial projects like the Great Wall. During the Qin Dynasty, the corvée burden was particularly crushing. Emperor Qin Shi Huang's ambitious building projects, the Great Wall, his massive tomb complex with its terracotta army, palaces, roads, required hundreds of thousands of workers. These workers were conscripted peasants torn from their farms during crucial agricultural seasons. Many died from exhaustion, accidents, or disease. The excessive labor demands contributed significantly to the dynasty's rapid collapse after the emperor's death. Even in less extreme periods, corvée duty was dreaded. It could mean weeks or months away from home, during which time your fields went untended and your family struggled. You were not paid for this work beyond minimal food rations. If you failed to appear when summoned, you faced severe punishment, beatings, fines you could not afford, or forced labor with criminals. Military conscription was another burden. All adult men were liable for military service. During wartime, which was frequent, villages could be stripped of their young men. Soldiers were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and often used as little more than expendable infantry. Death rates were high. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. If you survived and returned home, you might find your farm had fallen into ruin during your absence. The agricultural calendar left little room for rest. Even during the slower winter months, there was work. Repairing tools, making clothes, processing harvested grain, preparing for the next planting. Religious festivals provided brief respites, times when families would gather, make offerings to ancestors, and share whatever special foods they could afford. But these moments were rare highlights in an otherwise relentless cycle of labor. Natural disasters made everything worse. Floods along the Yellow River were legendary in their destructiveness. The river earned the nickname China's Sorrow for the millions who died in floods over the centuries. When floods came, they destroyed crops, swept away homes, and drowned livestock. Survivors faced starvation. Droughts were equally devastating. Crops withered in the fields. Wells ran dry. People ate bark, grass, whatever they could find. Contemporary records from various dynasties describe desperate peasants selling their children, committing suicide, or turning to banditry simply to survive. And through it all, the tax collector still came. The imperial government showed little mercy to farmers whose harvests had failed. Records from the Han Dynasty describe officials who would confiscate whatever they could find: tools, cooking pots, even the clothes families wore, to satisfy tax debts. Some families sold themselves into slavery to escape crushing debt. Others simply fled, abandoning their land and becoming vagrants or bandits, which carried its own severe risks. This was the reality for most people in ancient China. Not the romanticized life of harmony with nature that appears in classical poetry, but a grinding struggle against poverty, hunger, natural disaster, and the insatiable demands of the state. The average peasant lived in constant fear. Fear of bad weather, fear of tax collectors, fear of bandits, fear of disease, fear of arbitrary punishment by local officials. Life expectancy was short. Many children died before reaching adulthood. Women often died in childbirth. Men died from overwork, accidents, or violence. Those who survived to old age were considered fortunate, their longevity attributed to the protection of ancestors or the favor of gods. The hollow belly, food, and famine. What did people eat in ancient China? The answer depends greatly on where and when you lived. But for peasants, the answer was almost always the same: not enough. In northern China, the staple grain was millet, a hardy crop that could grow in relatively dry conditions. Wheat and barley were also cultivated, often made into noodles, dumplings, or rough flatbreads. These grains formed the bulk of the peasant diet. You ate them at every meal, often with nothing else. A bowl of millet porridge for breakfast, more millet, perhaps with a few pickled vegetables for the midday meal. The same for dinner. Rice, though it would eventually become associated with Chinese cuisine throughout the world, was initially a luxury in the north. It required specific growing conditions, flat land that could be flooded, ample water, a warmer climate. These conditions existed primarily in southern China. Rice cultivation was more labor-intensive than growing millet or wheat, but it produced higher yields, which is why it gradually became more important over the centuries. However, for northern peasants, especially in earlier periods, rice was expensive and rare. A bowl of rice was something you might enjoy once or twice a year during major festivals. Vegetables supplemented the grain-heavy diet when available. Soybeans, which originated in China around 1000 BCE, were crucial. They could be eaten fresh, dried, or processed into tofu, a protein-rich food that helped compensate for the lack of meat. Cucumbers, various leafy greens, turnips, onions, and garlic were common. Vegetables were often pickled to preserve them through the winter. Fermented and pickled vegetables became a staple because they could be stored for months and provided some nutritional variety during times when fresh produce was unavailable. Meat was a rarity for peasants. Pork, chicken, and fish were consumed on special occasions, festivals, weddings, important ancestral ceremonies. But animals that could be eaten were also valuable in other ways. Pigs could forage for themselves and turn waste into fertilizer. Chickens provided eggs. Fish required rivers or ponds and knowledge of fishing techniques. Cattle and water buffalo were far too valuable as draft animals to be slaughtered for food. Beef was almost never eaten by common people. Wealthy families, by contrast, enjoyed a much more varied diet. They ate meat regularly, including wild game like deer, pheasant, and duck. They could afford refined grains, cooking oils, and expensive seasonings. Cooking methods reflected economic constraints. Wealthy families had kitchens with proper stoves, servants to prepare elaborate meals, and the leisure to enjoy lengthy banquets. Peasant cooking was basic. A simple hearth or clay stove, fueled by straw, wood, or dried animal dung, provided heat. The primary cooking techniques were boiling and steaming. Stir-frying, which requires oil and high heat, was less common among the poor because cooking oil was expensive. Instead, ingredients were often boiled together in a single pot to make gruel or soup. This conserved fuel and made the limited ingredients stretch further. Salt was essential for preserving food and for health, but it was not freely available. During several dynasties, salt production and distribution were government monopolies. Salt merchants became wealthy, but ordinary people had to buy it at prices set by the state. If you could not afford salt, your food was bland and your health suffered. Historical records mention peasants collecting salty soil and boiling it down, or traveling to distant salt sources, risking punishment for violating state monopolies. Tea, which would become synonymous with Chinese culture, was initially a luxury. It began to be cultivated and consumed widely during the Han Dynasty, but peasants could rarely afford good tea. They might drink hot water, possibly with some common herbs, but the refined teas enjoyed by the wealthy were beyond their means. Famines were a constant threat. Chinese history is punctuated by devastating famines that killed millions. These were caused by various factors: flooding, drought, unseasonable cold, locust swarms, or combinations thereof. When harvests failed, peasants faced starvation. The government maintained granaries theoretically to distribute grain during emergencies. But corruption, poor transportation, and bureaucratic incompetence often meant that relief came too late or not at all. During famines, people resorted to desperate measures. They ate tree bark stripped from whatever trees were available. They made flour from ground-up roots and wild plants, many of which were barely edible and provided almost no nutrition. They ate grass, insects, even dirt mixed with whatever they could find to make it seem like food. Parents sold children to anyone who could feed them, hoping the child might survive. Some children were abandoned at monasteries or temples. Others were simply left to die. Contemporary sources from the Eastern Han Dynasty describe a catastrophic famine around 194 CE, in which, according to the records, people in some regions resorted to cannibalism. Similar accounts appear in texts from other dynasties during severe famines. It should be noted that such accounts may have been exaggerated or included for rhetorical purposes, to emphasize the severity of the crisis or to criticize rulers for failing to prevent such conditions. What we can say with certainty, based on extensive historical documentation, is that famines pushed people to the absolute limits of survival, and the social fabric that normally governed behavior could break down entirely when the alternative was watching your family starve to death. The impact of malnutrition was profound. Stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and various deficiency conditions were common among the poor. Children who survived on inadequate diets grew up smaller and weaker than proper nutrition would have allowed. Women of childbearing age were particularly vulnerable. Inadequate nutrition made pregnancy and childbirth even more dangerous than they already were, contributing to high maternal mortality rates. While specific vitamin deficiency diseases like pellagra, beriberi, and scurvy existed in ancient China, the extent to which they were recognized as distinct conditions, rather than general weakness or illness, is unclear from historical records. What is certain is that the chronic undernourishment experienced by much of the population had severe health consequences across all age groups. Even in good years, peasants lived on the edge of subsistence. There was no safety margin. One bad harvest, one flood, one drought, and you faced starvation. This precariousness shaped psychology and behavior. Peasants were cautious, conservative, risk-averse. Innovation was dangerous. Experimenting with new crops or methods might yield better results, but it might also lead to disaster. Better to stick with proven methods, even if they barely kept you alive. Food was not just sustenance, but also a marker of social status. What you ate, how you ate it, and with whom all conveyed information about your place in society. The wealthy ate from fine porcelain dishes, used silver or gold utensils, and enjoyed meals with multiple courses. Peasants ate from rough clay bowls or wooden vessels, used their hands or simple wooden spoons, and consumed meals that were monotonous and meager. During the Sui dynasty, laws were passed restricting peasants to wearing blue or black clothing and implicitly regulating other aspects of their lifestyle to maintain visible distinction from the upper classes. The ritualized importance of food appears in Chinese language and culture. The common greeting, "Have you eaten?" reflects a society where having enough food was never guaranteed. Rice, in particular, acquired sacred significance. Wasting rice was considered deeply shameful. Every grain was precious, representing not just food, but the labor required to produce it. To this day, Chinese culture retains echoes of that agricultural past. The hard-won knowledge that survival depends on the harvest, and the harvest depends on ceaseless work and favorable weather, things that are never entirely within human control. Darkness and danger, living conditions in ancient China. If you were fortunate enough to be born into a wealthy family, your home might resemble the classical Chinese architecture we recognize today. Large wooden houses built around courtyards with tiled roofs that curved gracefully upward, multiple rooms for different purposes, and gardens designed according to principles of harmony and balance. These homes had furniture, tables, chairs, beds raised off the floor. They had interior courtyards that brought light and air into the living spaces. They had storage areas, separate quarters for different branches of the extended family, and spaces dedicated to ancestor worship. But you were not born into a wealthy family. Statistically, you were born into a peasant household, and peasant homes bore no resemblance to those elegant structures. We have already described the basic construction: rammed earth walls, thatched roofs, dirt floors, But let us look more closely at what it meant to live in such a dwelling. First, consider the size. 15 feet by 15 feet, perhaps slightly larger, for an entire family. That is roughly the size of a modern American bedroom. Now imagine fitting 6 or 7 people into that space, along with their possessions, cooking equipment, and whatever supplies could be kept indoors. There was no concept of privacy. Everyone heard everything. Everyone saw everything. Children grew up witnessing every aspect of adult life. Arguments, intimacy, illness, death. Modesty, in the modern sense, was impossible. You changed clothes in the presence of your family. You relieved yourself in a chamber pot or just outside the dwelling. In some areas, designated waste pits served multiple households. Human waste was collected and used as fertilizer, night soil, as it was called. The smell would have been ever present, though people of the time would have grown accustomed to it in ways we cannot imagine. During winter in northern China, temperatures plunged below freezing. Your thin walls and thatched roof provided minimal insulation. Families huddled together for warmth, sleeping in a pile like animals. The cooking fire was the only source of heat. Keeping it burning required constant fuel, which meant gathering firewood or cutting brush. Yet another task added to the endless list of chores. Smoke from the fire filled the dwelling, blackening walls and ceilings, irritating eyes and lungs, contributing to respiratory diseases that shortened lives. Summer brought different miseries. The same walls that failed to keep out winter cold also failed to provide relief from summer heat. Without windows, air circulation was poor. The interior became stifling. Mosquitoes bred in rice paddies and irrigation channels, spreading malaria and other diseases. Other insects, fleas, lice, bedbugs, were constant companions. There were no screens, no insecticides, no way to escape the biting, itching, disease-carrying pests that shared your living space. Wealthy households could afford certain technologies that improved quality of life. Records from the Tang Dynasty mention mechanical fans, ice-cooled rooms, and even primitive air conditioning systems in imperial palaces. They had indoor bathing facilities with heated water. Peasants, by contrast, bathed rarely and then only in cold water from wells or rivers. During winter, bathing was nearly impossible. Bodies were wiped down with damp cloths, if at all. Cleanliness was a luxury, not a right. The lack of sanitation had predictable consequences. Diseases spread rapidly through villages. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever, and various parasitic infections were common. Contaminated water was a primary culprit. Wells could become polluted by seepage from latrines, animal waste, or decomposing organic matter. Rivers served multiple purposes: drinking water source, bathing spot, latrine, waste disposal. People understood on some level that dirty water caused illness. But without alternatives, they had little choice but to use what was available. Traditional Chinese medicine attempted to address health problems, but its effectiveness was limited. Physicians existed in towns and cities, but their services were expensive and rarely accessible to peasants. Village healers used herbs, acupuncture, and other traditional methods. Some remedies worked, Certain herbs did have genuine medicinal properties. Others were pure superstition. Regardless, when serious illness struck, your chances of survival depended more on luck and your general health than on any treatment you might receive. Life expectancy was shockingly low by modern standards. Infant and child mortality rates were especially high. While exact figures are difficult to establish for ancient periods, evidence from burial sites and later historical records suggests that in some periods and regions, anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of children may have died before reaching age 5. The causes included infectious diseases, malnutrition, accidents, and complications from conditions that would be minor today, but were life-threatening without modern medicine. Mothers frequently died in childbirth from hemorrhaging, infection, or complications. The grief of losing children was so common that it became woven into the fabric of life. Parents expected to bury some of their children. If they all survived to adulthood, the family considered themselves extraordinarily fortunate. Accidents were common and often fatal. Working with primitive tools, large animals, and in hazardous conditions led to injuries. A broken bone might heal badly, leaving you permanently disabled and unable to work. A death sentence in a society with no safety net. Cuts and scrapes could become infected. Without antibiotics, even small infections could turn deadly. Burns from cooking fires, drowning in irrigation channels or rivers, being kicked by livestock, falling from heights while repairing a roof. Danger lurked in ordinary activities. The psychological toll of these living conditions is difficult to quantify, but must have been enormous. Constant physical discomfort, perpetual uncertainty about food, the loss of children, the relentless labor, the absence of hope for a better future. These factors shaped worldview and behavior. Religion offered some comfort, beliefs in ancestors, in gods who could be propitiated with offerings, in karma and rebirth. But religion also reinforced the social order, teaching that your suffering in this life resulted from misdeeds in past lives, and that enduring it properly might earn you a better rebirth. Housing arrangements in towns and cities were somewhat different, but not necessarily better for common people. Urban laborers lived in cramped quarters, often several families sharing a single building. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, turning to mud in rain. Waste disposal was primitive. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or alleys. Butchers dumped offal. Craftsmen discarded scraps. The smell must have been overwhelming. Cities were disease incubators, even worse than rural villages in some respects, because population density was higher. Wealthy urban homes, by contrast, were built with an eye toward feng shui principles. They faced south to capture sunlight and warmth. They had multiple courtyards, creating private spaces for different purposes. Walls surrounded the compound, providing security and privacy. Interior rooms were decorated with carved wood panels, painted screens, and artwork. Furniture was carefully crafted and valuable. Gardens featured rocks, water features, and carefully cultivated plants. These homes were oases of civilization, but they were accessible to only a tiny fraction of the population. The sword of justice, law, and punishment in ancient China. Now let us turn to one of the darkest aspects of ancient Chinese life, the legal system. If you found yourself accused of a crime, your situation was almost hopeless. The Chinese legal system was designed not to determine guilt or innocence, but to extract confessions and impose punishments that would serve as deterrents to others. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were arrested and brought before a magistrate, it was assumed you had done something wrong. The concept of defense counsel did not exist. You had no right to an attorney, no right to present evidence in your favor, no right to cross-examine witnesses. The magistrate acted as investigator, prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once. His primary tool for determining the truth was torture. Torture was legally sanctioned and widely practiced as a method of obtaining confessions. The underlying logic was that a person who was truly innocent would maintain their innocence even under torture, while a guilty person would confess to make the pain stop. This assumption was deeply flawed. In reality, innocent people frequently confessed to crimes they had not committed simply to end the agony, while determined individuals, whether guilty or innocent, sometimes endured torture without confessing. Nevertheless, the system persisted for centuries because it was efficient from the state's perspective and served the government's interest in maintaining order through fear. The instruments of torture were varied and horrifying. The bastinado, beating the soles of the feet with a bamboo rod, was among the least severe. It caused excruciating pain, but usually did not result in permanent injury or death. Victims would have their feet secured, and an executioner would strike them repeatedly. The pain was intense enough to induce confession, and the damage to the feet often left victims unable to walk properly for weeks or months. For peasants whose survival depended on physical labor, this was devastating. More severe methods included finger-crushing devices, wooden blocks between which fingers were inserted and then gradually compressed until bones broke, hanging by the thumbs or wrists, kneeling on chains, sharp objects, obelisks or iron rods, being stretched on racks, having heavy stones placed on the body while being forced to maintain certain positions. Each method was designed to inflict maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious and capable of speech so they could confess. The 5 punishments, which had their origins in ancient times and evolved over centuries, defined the formal penalty structure. In their earliest form, these punishments were mutilation, tattooing the face, cutting off the nose, amputation of feet, castration, and death. Later dynasties modified these to be somewhat less barbaric, replacing mutilation with beatings, penal servitude, and exile. But the underlying brutality remained. Tattooing the face, called Mo or Qing, marked criminals permanently, ensuring they carried the shame of their crime for life. The tattoo was usually applied to the forehead or cheeks using ink made from soot or other permanent pigments. This punishment not only inflicted pain, but also destroyed the person's social standing. They could never return to normal life, as their face advertised their criminal status to everyone they met. Amputation punishments, cutting off the nose or feet, were designed to disable and disfigure. Removal of the nose was not only disfiguring, but affected breathing and speech. Amputation of feet, called UA, made it impossible to run away or work effectively in fields. These punishments turned criminals into beggars dependent on others for survival. The Qin Dynasty was particularly fond of such penalties, using them liberally on anyone who transgressed the law. Castration, called gong when applied to men, was reserved primarily for sexual offences or for creating eunuchs to serve in the imperial palace. The procedure was crude and performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Many men died from infection or blood loss. Survivors faced a life of shame and physical complications, yet some men voluntarily underwent castration to enter palace service, seeing it as the only path to power and wealth available to someone from a poor background. The death penalty came in many forms, each more terrible than the last. The least severe was strangulation, which at least was relatively quick. Decapitation was common for serious crimes. But for the most heinous offences, treason, rebellion, killing one's master or parent, certain religious crimes, far worse punishments awaited. Lingchi, known in English as death by 1,000 cuts or slow slicing, was perhaps the most horrific punishment ever devised. The condemned person was tied to a wooden frame, and executioners would use sharp knives to slowly remove pieces of flesh over a period that could last hours or even days. The goal was to keep the victim alive and conscious as long as possible, maximizing suffering. This punishment was public, intended to serve as a powerful deterrent. The last documented case of lingchi occurred in China in 1905, though it had been officially abolished shortly before. Other execution methods included boiling alive, dismemberment by having limbs tied to 4 horses, or carts that were driven in different directions, being buried alive, or being thrown into a fire. These extreme punishments were reserved for the worst crimes, but they were used with disturbing frequency during periods of strict rule. The Tang Dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907 CE, is often considered a high point of Chinese civilization. Even during this relatively enlightened period, the legal code listed 144 crimes punishable by strangulation and 89 punishable by decapitation. The Tang Code also defined what became known as the 10 Abominations, categories of particularly heinous crimes including plotting rebellion, plotting great sedition, plotting treason, committing parricide, demonstrating great irreverence toward the emperor or state rituals, demonstrating lack of filial piety, discord within the family, and what was termed moral turpitude. Within these broad categories, numerous specific acts could warrant death. Collective punishment was another distinctive feature of Chinese law. If you committed certain serious crimes, particularly treason or rebellion, not only you, but your entire extended family could be executed. During the Ming Dynasty, the writer Fang Xiaoru refused to write an edict supporting the new emperor after a palace coup. In retaliation, Emperor Yongle ordered the execution of Fang's 9 familial exterminations, a concept that was expanded to 10 in this case, encompassing 873 people, including distant relatives, friends, students, and associates. This practice ensured that families policed themselves, knowing that one person's actions could doom them all. For lesser crimes, punishments included beatings with bamboo canes or larger wooden rods, the number of strokes determined by the severity of the offense. These beatings were administered on the buttocks, back, or legs. They were painful, humiliating, and could cause serious injury or death if administered with sufficient force. The kang, a large wooden board worn around the neck like a portable pillory, was used to punish and shame minor offenders. The person had to wear it for a specified period, sometimes days or weeks, during which they could not feed themselves, lie down properly, or escape public mockery. Prisons existed but were not used as the primary form of punishment. Instead, they were holding facilities where people awaited trial or execution. Conditions were appalling, crowded, filthy, dark, with minimal food and water. Disease spread rapidly. Wealthy prisoners could sometimes bribe guards to obtain better treatment, but poor prisoners suffered terribly. Some died before their cases were even heard. The appeals process was limited and often ineffective. Theoretically, you could appeal to higher authorities if you believed you had been unjustly convicted. In practice, this rarely worked. Officials protected each other. Overturning a lower official's decision would embarrass him and disrupt the hierarchy. Unless you had powerful connections or significant wealth to offer as bribes, your appeal would likely be ignored or dismissed. Women faced particular vulnerabilities in the legal system. They had even fewer rights than men. A woman could be punished for adultery or disobedience to her husband, while male adultery was treated far less seriously. A wife who killed her husband faced execution, but a husband who killed his wife might receive only a beating if he could claim she had provoked him. Women from mean classes, prostitutes, entertainers, and others, had essentially no legal protection. They could be abused, exploited, or killed with little consequence for the perpetrator. The entire system was designed to maintain order through fear. The law was less about justice than about control. By making punishments so severe and so public, the government hoped to deter crime and reinforce obedience. To a large extent, it worked. Jesuit missionaries who visited China in the 17th century commented on how orderly and law-abiding Chinese society appeared compared to Europe, where violence and banditry were far more common. But this order came at a tremendous human cost. The invisible enemy, disease and medicine. Disease was the great equalizer in ancient China, striking rich and poor alike, though the poor suffered far more and died in far greater numbers. Without modern medicine, sanitation, or understanding of germ theory, people were helpless before illnesses that today would be easily treated or prevented. Epidemics swept through China periodically, killing thousands or millions. The written record of Chinese epidemics stretches back thousands of years. Oracle bone inscriptions from the Han Dynasty mention outbreaks of disease. Historical texts compiled during later dynasties catalogue hundreds of major epidemics. These were often described in vague terms: pestilence or great mortality, making it difficult for modern scholars to determine exactly what diseases were involved. But the human cost was clear. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases. The virus caused fever, severe pain, and characteristic pustules that covered the body. Mortality rates varied but could reach 30% or higher. Survivors were often left with permanent scarring and sometimes blindness. There was no effective treatment. Variolation, a primitive form of inoculation where material from smallpox lesions was deliberately introduced into a healthy person to induce a mild case and provide immunity, was practiced in China as early as the 10th century CE, centuries before it appeared in Europe. This procedure carried significant risks, but it reduced mortality compared to naturally acquired smallpox. Malaria was endemic in many regions, particularly in southern China, where mosquitoes bred prolifically in rice paddies and wetlands. The recurring fevers, chills, and weakness caused by malaria sapped people's strength and made them vulnerable to other diseases. The connection between mosquitoes and malaria was not understood, so prevention was impossible beyond avoiding marshy areas when practical, which was not an option for farmers who worked in rice paddies daily. Tuberculosis, a bacterial infection that primarily attacks the lungs, was common in crowded, poorly ventilated living conditions. The disease spread through coughing and close contact. It caused progressive weight loss, chronic cough, blood in the sputum, and ultimately death if untreated. The slow progression of tuberculosis meant that infected individuals could spread the disease for months or years before dying themselves. Leprosy, though relatively less common than other diseases, was greatly feared due to its visible symptoms: skin lesions, nerve damage leading to loss of sensation, progressive disfigurement. People with leprosy were often segregated from society and forced to live in isolation. This social death accompanied the physical decline caused by the disease. Bubonic plague made periodic appearances in China, though major outbreaks were sporadic and geographically limited until the 14th century, when the plague devastated populations across Asia and Europe. The disease was transmitted by fleas living on rats, but this mechanism was not understood at the time. When plague struck, mortality rates were horrifyingly high, often 50% or more of those infected. The sudden onset of fever, swelling of lymph nodes, buboes, and rapid progression to death created panic and social breakdown. Parasitic infections were ubiquitous. Roundworms, tapeworms, liver flukes, and other parasites infected people who ate contaminated food or drank contaminated water. These parasites caused malnutrition, anemia, and various other health problems. Some parasites could live in human hosts for years, steadily weakening the person. Diarrheal diseases, caused by various bacteria and protozoa, killed countless people, especially children. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever were all transmitted through contaminated water or food. In a world without sewage systems or water treatment, these diseases were constant threats. A bout of severe diarrhea could rapidly lead to fatal dehydration, particularly in children and the elderly. Chinese medicine developed sophisticated theories and treatments over thousands of years. The concept of qi, vital energy flowing through the body, and the balance of yin and yang were fundamental to medical philosophy. Physicians diagnosed patients by examining the pulse, observing the tongue and complexion, and asking about symptoms. Treatments included herbal remedies, acupuncture, moxibustion, burning herbs on or near the skin, dietary recommendations, and exercise practices like qigong. Some traditional Chinese remedies were effective. Herbs containing compounds that genuinely treated certain conditions were discovered through trial and error over centuries. Ephedrine, derived from the Emma Huang plant, could treat respiratory conditions. Artemisinin, extracted from sweet wormwood, was effective against malaria, though its use for this purpose may not have been fully understood until modern times. Ginseng, ginger, and various other herbs had documented therapeutic benefits. However, many treatments were ineffective or harmful. Diagnostic methods, while elaborate, often led to incorrect conclusions about the nature of illness. The theory of humors and vital energies, while philosophically sophisticated, did not accurately reflect the biological mechanisms of disease. Some remedies contained toxic substances. Mercury and arsenic were sometimes used in medicines, causing poisoning. Animal parts believed to have medicinal properties, tiger bone, rhinoceros horn, various organs, had no actual therapeutic benefit, but drove species to the brink of extinction. Surgery was limited and dangerous. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, surgical procedures were extraordinarily painful and usually led to fatal infections. Chinese physicians generally avoided surgery, except in the most desperate circumstances. Setting broken bones, treating wounds, and removing superficial tumors were about the extent of surgical practice. Childbirth was particularly dangerous for women. Maternal mortality rates were high. Women died from hemorrhaging, infections, obstructed labor, and various complications. Midwives assisted with births, but their knowledge was empirical and limited. If complications arose that required surgical intervention, both mother and child usually died. Infant mortality was shockingly high. Besides the infectious diseases that killed children, malnutrition, accidents, and infanticide claimed many lives. Female infanticide was practiced, particularly during times of hardship when families could not afford to feed all their children, and viewed daughters as less valuable than sons, since daughters would marry into other families. Mental illness was poorly understood. People experiencing what we would recognize as depression, anxiety disorders, psychosis, or other mental health conditions were sometimes seen as possessed by spirits or punished by gods. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to religious rituals. In some cases, the mentally ill were cared for by their families. In others, they were cast out or confined. The wealthy could afford better medical care than the poor. They had access to skilled physicians, expensive medicines, and better living conditions that reduced disease risk. They ate better, lived in cleaner homes, and could afford to rest when ill rather than continuing to work. But even wealth offered limited protection. Emperors and nobles died from diseases just as commoners did, though perhaps at somewhat lower rates. The absence of effective medicine meant that disease shaped life expectancy, population size, and social patterns. Periodic epidemics killed enough people to cause labor shortages, disrupt trade, and even contribute to the fall of dynasties when the economic and social fabric unraveled. The constant threat of disease reinforced religious beliefs, as people sought supernatural explanations and interventions for afflictions they could not understand or control. Women's lives, subordination, and survival. The lives of women in ancient China were defined by subordination, limited rights, and prescribed roles that offered little freedom or autonomy. From birth to death, a woman's existence was controlled by men. First her father, then her husband, and finally her sons if she survived to widowhood. The Confucian ideology that dominated Chinese thought for over 2 millennia explicitly defined women as inferior to men. One of the fundamental Confucian principles was the 3 obediences. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband during marriage, and her eldest son after her husband's death. This principle codified female subordination into law and custom. Female infanticide was practiced, though its extent varied by period and region. When families could not afford to raise all their children, daughters were sometimes killed at birth or abandoned. The preference for male children was rooted in economic and social realities. Sons would remain with the family, support their parents in old age, and continue the family line. Daughters would marry out, becoming part of their husband's family. A family that invested in raising daughters was, in effect, raising children for another household. Girls who survived childhood faced limited prospects. Education for women was rare, primarily confined to wealthy families, and even then it was restricted. The vast majority of women were illiterate. Some elite families taught daughters basic reading so they could manage household accounts or read religious and moral texts. But advanced education was almost entirely reserved for men. Women were completely excluded from the civil service examination system, which was the primary path to power and prestige in imperial China. Marriage was not a matter of personal choice, but rather a family arrangement designed to create alliances and economic benefits. Matchmakers would negotiate marriages between families. A girl typically had no say in whom she would marry. She might not even meet her husband before the wedding day. The wedding ceremony transferred her from her father's authority to her husband's authority. She left her birth family and became part of her husband's family, living in his household and serving his parents. A bride entered her new home in the lowest position within the household hierarchy. She was subordinate to her mother-in-law, who often treated her harshly. The relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law was notoriously difficult. The mother-in-law, having endured years of subordination herself, often exercised power over the new bride in ways that could be cruel. The bride was expected to perform the hardest household labor, show absolute deference, and accept criticism and punishment without complaint. A woman's primary duty was to produce sons. Her status in the household depended largely on her fertility, particularly her ability to bear male children. A woman who bore no sons faced scorn, possible abandonment, or the introduction of a concubine into the household to produce the desired male heirs. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous, as we have discussed, but they were also the only way for a woman to secure her position. Foot binding, which began sometime around the 10th century CE and persisted until the early 20th century, exemplified the subordination of women. The practice involved tightly binding young girls' feet to prevent normal growth, creating the lotus feet that were considered beautiful and a mark of status. The process was excruciatingly painful. Bones were broken and the foot deformed into an unnatural shape. Women with bound feet had difficulty walking and could not perform field labor or other strenuous physical work. This effectively ensured that women with bound feet were dependent on others and confined to domestic spaces. The practice was most common among the wealthy and aspirational middle classes. Peasant women often did not have their feet bound because they needed to work in the fields. Women had minimal legal rights. They could not own property in their own name. A married woman's property belonged to her husband. If divorced or widowed, she might have some rights to a portion of her deceased husband's estate, but this was controlled by male relatives. Women could not initiate divorce. A man could divorce his wife for various reasons: failure to bear sons, adultery, disrespect to his parents, excessive talking, jealousy, disease, or theft. A wife could not divorce her husband regardless of how he treated her. Adultery laws were harshly asymmetrical. A wife who committed adultery faced severe punishment, possibly death. A husband who had affairs or kept concubines faced no legal consequences. Wealthy men routinely kept concubines, who lived in the household alongside the official wife. Concubines had even fewer rights than wives. They were essentially high-status servants, whose primary function was to bear children and provide sexual services. Widowhood offered some women a measure of autonomy, though it came at great cost. A widow, especially one who had adult sons, could wield authority within the household. But widows were expected to remain chaste and loyal to their deceased husband's memory. Remarriage was technically possible, but socially frowned upon, especially for women of higher social classes. A widow who remained faithful was praised as virtuous. One who remarried was condemned. Despite these crushing restrictions, some women found ways to exert influence. Elite women could be well educated in literature and arts, even if they could not take the examinations. Some became renowned poets or painters. A few women from powerful families wielded significant behind-the-scenes political influence. The Empress Dowager Cixi, who effectively ruled China for nearly 5 decades in the late 19th century, is a famous example, though she operated in a much later period. Peasant women, while lacking the education and refinement of elite women, worked alongside men in the fields out of economic necessity. This gave them slightly more practical equality in some respects, though they remained legally and socially subordinate. They managed household finances, raised children, produced textiles, tended gardens, raised small livestock, and performed countless other tasks essential to family survival. Buddhist and Taoist nunneries offered some women an escape from the marriage system. By taking religious vows, a woman could live in a community of women, pursue spiritual practices, and avoid the subordination of marriage. However, this path was available to relatively few women and required family consent or considerable personal determination to pursue. The Confucian ideal of womanhood was codified in texts like the Nujie, Instructions for Women, written in the Han Dynasty by Ban Zhao, one of China's first female historians. This text instructed women to be humble, industrious, obedient, and self-effacing. It told that a woman's virtue lay in service to her family and subordination to male authority. Such texts were used for centuries to educate girls about their proper role. The psychological impact of these restrictions must have been profound. Women grew up knowing that they were valued less than their brothers, that their lives would be constrained by rules and expectations they had no power to change, then that their worth was measured primarily by their ability to produce male children. Yet they found ways to survive, to care for their children, to create bonds with other women, and occasionally to exert quiet influence within the narrow bounds of their circumstances. Knowledge and its limits. Education in ancient China. Education in ancient China was not universal, nor was it designed to be. It served specific purposes: to train officials, to maintain Confucian orthodoxy, and to reinforce social hierarchy. Access to education was determined primarily by wealth and gender, with only a tiny fraction of the population receiving formal schooling. For boys born into families wealthy enough to afford it, education began around age 6 or 7. A tutor might be hired, or the child might attend a small private school run by a local scholar. The curriculum was rigorous and focused almost entirely on memorization of classical texts. Students learned to read and write Chinese characters, which required memorizing thousands of individual characters, each with its own meaning and pronunciation. This was no small feat. Unlike alphabetic writing systems, Chinese writing provided few clues to pronunciation from the visual form of the character. Every character had to be learned individually through repetition. The core texts of the curriculum were the Confucian classics. These included the 4 books, the Analects of Confucius, the Mencius, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the Great Learning, and the 5 classics: the Book of Changes, the Book of Documents, the Book of Poetry, the Book of Rites, and the Spring and Autumn Annals. Students spent years, even decades, memorizing these texts and studying the orthodox commentaries that explained their meaning. The goal of this education was to prepare young men for the civil service examinations. These examinations, as we have discussed, were the primary path to government office, and thus to wealth, status, and power. The exams tested knowledge of the classics, ability to write in proper literary forms, and understanding of Confucian principles as they applied to governance and ethics. The examination system had multiple levels. The lowest level exams were held at the county seat. Those who passed became chiukai, or cultivated talents. This basic degree conferred some status but no government position. The Siukai could then attempt higher-level exams at the prefectural capital. Successful candidates became juren, or recommended men, and were eligible for official appointments, though positions were limited. The highest-level exams were held in the imperial capital. Those who passed became jinshi, or presented scholars, and were virtually guaranteed prestigious positions in the bureaucracy. The competition was fierce. Thousands of candidates sat for the exams at each level, but only a small percentage passed. The exams themselves were grueling ordeals. Candidates were locked in tiny cells for days, sometimes weeks, writing essays in response to questions about the classics. They had to demonstrate mastery of complex literary forms, especially the eight-legged essay, which followed strict structural rules. The pressure was immense. Some candidates took the exams dozens of times over their lifetimes without ever passing. Some went mad from the stress. Some died during the examinations from exhaustion or illness. For those who did pass, the rewards were substantial. A jinshi degree holder could expect appointment to important positions: county magistrate, court official, even ministerial posts for the most talented. These positions brought salary, status, and opportunities for enrichment through both legal means, gifts from grateful citizens, and illegal ones, bribes and embezzlement. An entire family's fortune could be made by one member achieving high examination success. But the examination system was far from meritocratic despite its rhetoric. While theoretically open to almost all male subjects, in practice it favored the wealthy. Preparing for the exams required years of study with expensive tutors. Poor families could not afford this investment. Even if a poor boy showed exceptional talent, the cost of tutors, books, and the time spent studying rather than working often made examination preparation impossible. Moreover, the system tended to reproduce itself. Sons of officials had the advantage of growing up in households where classical learning was valued and resources for education were abundant. They had networks of connections that could help their careers even beyond examination success. The rhetoric of meritocracy obscured the reality that most officials came from families that had produced officials for generations. Women were almost entirely excluded from formal education. Some wealthy families taught daughters basic literacy, especially in later dynasties when female literacy became fashionable among the elite. A few women became celebrated poets or painters, but these were rare exceptions. The examination system was closed to women, and most families saw no point in educating daughters who would marry into other families and whose role would be domestic. The content of education was also highly conservative. The Confucian classics emphasized hierarchy, obedience, proper conduct, and reverence for the past. Innovation was discouraged. The goal was to absorb and replicate the wisdom of the ancients, not to question or create new knowledge. This had profound effects on Chinese society, contributing to both stability and stagnation. Science and technology, though valued in practical contexts, were not part of the examination curriculum. Merchants and craftsmen developed considerable expertise in their fields, but this knowledge was not considered worthy of scholarly attention. The division between those who worked with their minds and those who worked with their hands was stark, and the former looked down on the latter. The examination system, for all its flaws, did allow some degree of social mobility. There are documented cases of poor boys who, through brilliance and perseverance, passed the examinations and rose to high positions. These success stories were celebrated and held up as proof that the system worked. But they were exceptional. Most officials came from families that had produced officials for generations. The system reinforced existing inequalities, even as it claimed to transcend them. Reflecting on an impossible life. We have journeyed through the realities of life in ancient China, stripping away the myths and romanticism to reveal a world of harsh inequality, brutal punishments, relentless labor, devastating disease, and profound suffering. For the overwhelming majority of people who lived in this time and place, life was not an adventure or a philosophical journey. It was a struggle, a daily fight for survival against hunger, illness, natural disaster, and human cruelty. Could you survive in ancient China? Probably not. At least not for long. If disease did not kill you, hunger might. If hunger did not kill you, overwork might. If overwork did not kill you, an accident, a natural disaster, or the arbitrary cruelty of officials might. And if somehow you managed to avoid all of these fates, you would still face a life so limited, so constrained by social hierarchy and economic desperation, that it would bear little resemblance to anything we consider worth living today. This is not to say that ancient China was uniquely terrible. Most pre-modern societies were similarly harsh for common people. Peasant life in medieval Europe, ancient Rome, or feudal Japan was equally brutal in many respects. But ancient China is worth understanding precisely because it is often misunderstood, romanticized into a land of wisdom and harmony when the reality was far darker. Yet people did survive. They endured. They found moments of joy in festivals, in family, in small acts of beauty or kindness. They created art, music, poetry, and philosophy that continue to inspire us. The civilization that produced such suffering also produced remarkable achievements. This paradox, that great art and profound thought can emerge from societies built on exploitation and cruelty, is worth contemplating. As you lie in your comfortable bed tonight, in your climate-controlled home, with clean water at your fingertips and medical care available if you need it, take a moment to appreciate what you have. The simple freedoms we take for granted, to choose our work, to move freely, to speak our minds, to seek justice when wronged, were impossible dreams for most people throughout most of history. Ancient China reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that civilization can be sophisticated and brutal simultaneously, and that the comfortable life we enjoy today rests on the struggles and sacrifices of countless generations who came before us. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore history not to judge the past by present standards, but to understand the human experience in all its complexity, the darkness and the light, the suffering and the resilience. By understanding where we came from, we can better appreciate where we are and think more carefully about where we want to go. Thank you for listening, and may you find peace in your dreams, secure in the knowledge that you live in a time and place far kinder than ancient China ever was.